So I'm going to start by just asking a couple of questions to Redina and then to Gordon. So what changes have you seen in the fundraising landscape in the voluntary sector since COVID-19 hit?
I mean, I've kind of divided the changes I've seen into two groups or two areas. I see charities and churches that are doing well, so they are weathering the storm because they've adapted their messaging. For example, some of the clients I work with, we have been really hard at work creating new campaigns, new ways of communicating with supporters, staying in touch, sharing financial needs and raising funds. I have spoken to quite a few church leaders in my network. And incidentally, I studied theology at Spurgeon's College, so I have a lot of friends who are Baptist ministers. So I kind of go out and ask them different questions. And some of them were saying they have been in touch with their church members, they have sent out letters, they have communicated, and they have seen people respond by increasing giving. But at the same time, I've also seen charities and churches and some, mission organizations, probably more, smaller organizations and those who are maybe more conservative evangelical, who have kind of gone all quiet. I sent out an e-briefing to about 500 people, and I was really surprised when I hadn't done it for a while, and then I started back again in March. And I saw that 20-30% of the people that I emailed said, we are in furlough, I'm not working, we're not doing anything. So that's really something that is the sort of this kind of reaction that they're furloughed fundraising and communication staff. So they're not really, they're asleep at the helm. I've, again, spoken to church leaders who are doing these 30-40-minute digital services, and they're not asking for support. They're not even having an offering within their time because they are operating with these myths or in the settings, we shouldn't ask people because this is a difficult time. We should be out there serving and not really asking for help. This idea of kind of sacrifice. And that's, I was talking to a couple of Anglican ministers and they're saying, we'll be at the creek without a paddle. There are ministers of 3 small churches, in sort of in Liverpool Diocese, and some of them in the south, in another diocese, and they don't even know where to start, how to actually encourage fundraising. So they feel it's wrong to ask. But what I see, at least from my experience, I've got 5 clients I work with on a monthly basis, that we have had with a couple of these clients the best responses to fundraising appeals. We are sending out emails that are literally raising thousands of pounds. And these are not charities that are not doing anything big about COVID. They are still continuing some of their work and their mission work, but they've adapted and they are being honest and open with their constituents, and they are seeing a good response.
So there are charities who are really working hard to change their messaging, yeah, and other charities, other churches who are, although they're carrying on, they're not necessarily focusing on the COVID-19 emergency funding, but are just sharing the news that they really need help as well. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
I mean, some of the big organizations, I'm not talking about like the people who immediately changed were Tear Fund, were Oxfam, well, not Oxfam because it's not Christian, but Christian Aid, CAFOD, All We Can. They sort of immediately came on board saying poor communities, people we're helping. I mean, in terms of youth charities, XLP in London immediately said, look, can you donate your commute because we have got, young people with mental health problems. Can you reach out and help? So they did something, and the others have retreated because they feel, we shouldn't ask. We shouldn't be getting people to give to us. And maybe the people that they serve might not be able to help financially because their beneficiaries might be struggling. But actually, a number of their constituents have got the financial means to give generously. We are in a season of generosity. For me, the problems that the charity sector might hit would be at the beginning of next year, if there is a second wave of the pandemic, and if situation doesn't improve. But now it is really the time to kind of reach out and fundraise.
Lovely, thank you. Gordon, be interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, well, I think what Redina said is absolutely spot on, this idea that not hearing from people, the frequency of communications. I mean, one of the first lessons I learned in fundraising was a slogan, actually. It was repetition brings recognition, brings reward. So in other words, most people are not aware of our messages at the best of time. For instance, we could be sending out maybe half a dozen emails each week, but they'll probably only spot one of them, maybe not even read that one. One of the big issues we have, I think, as promoting our organizations and communicating with them is there's almost a fear of over contacting or over communicating with supporters. And I know as fundraisers, you always have this fear. It's almost inherent in all of us. And, you know, that's understandable. But I think that the reality is something different. If you're looking at things from the outside rather than from inside the organization, people who are supporting us don't, certainly not as aware of what's going on as we are. And we may be repeating a message very frequently, but it doesn't mean to say that our supporters, our core supporters, who may be dipping in and out, understand what those issues are or are even aware of them. So I think that's very important. It's one of the things I noticed in the first week of lockdown was that I just stopped hearing from people. It was almost as if there was a paralysis. And of course, people are thinking of the situation, how it's going to affect them, their loved ones, what the future holds. But at the same time, what I noticed was that some of the smarter companies that I deal with, you know, I'm a customer of theirs, they were sending out emails saying, we're still in business, we're still doing this, and I found it very reassuring in the midst of all this uncertainty. So on the back of that, I spoke to a client of mine and said, look, you know, I think we really ought to just get an email out there and repeat it for the rest of the week saying, this is what's going on at the moment. We still have these issues, and you know, that there could be an impact. We didn't know at that time. We just sent a mailing out, to direct mail, to over 14,000 donors, and we didn't know whether it was going to land. We didn't know whether it was going to be people who were going to respond to it. We didn't know whether the post office were going to deliver back the donations. But on the back of that, somebody sent in a £30,000 donation, you know, just literally by telling people what the situation is. We didn't expect that. We didn't really anticipate that. And we certainly didn't solicit that. And then there was just doing sort of social actions, saying we're doing this at the moment, we're doing that at the moment. Obviously, from a campaigning point of view, there are limitations on what you can do in lockdown. You can't do public events. But things like online petitions, for instance, to the government, and looking at particular issues which the government is maybe being involved with, which to do with your charity. There's usually something of relevance there, which people want to hear about and are happy to hear about. And then if there's a real need, and I think that's the key thing in all this, is demonstrating that there is a need now during lockdown, and there could well be a need in the aftermath of lockdown, because nobody knows. And I think we can actually capitalize on that uncertainty by saying, look, you know, hold our hands up. We don't know what's happening. Our supporters can recognize that, they can relate to that, because nobody knows what's going to happen. And somebody I've spoken to is actually one of our supporters, a donor, who said, well, look, you know, you shouldn't be afraid of asking for money at the moment, because I'm going to be careful here, because this isn't, you know, this doesn't cut across the board. But he said, you know, I've not been going to work for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I'm not having to spend money on travel. I've not had to spend money on other outgoings to do with work. I've actually got more money available now than I would have done before the lockdown. And I know, of course, not everybody's in that boat, and it's very difficult for some people. I've got a brother who's looks like he's going to lose his job altogether, and he doesn't know what he's going to do for the future. So it's not a question of being mercenary. I think it's just been a question of being realistic and understanding how other people are feeling and trying to tap into that.
And asking with sensitivity.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. And with gratitude.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And it is interesting with what you say, because I think when the kind of the impact of coronavirus hit and we went so suddenly into lockdown, everybody froze. It was like, oh, we just don't know what we're going to do. Churches suddenly, I have one church in London where they've lost 70% of their income because they're not, then they haven't got lettings anymore. They've got quite a small congregation, and it's finding ways to bridge that gap. But what I've seen kind of over the last week or so, more kind of churches now in London, and that's my role, are starting to say to me, okay, we now know that this is long term. How can we make up for some of our lost income? So it is now using this time, I feel, very wisely to plan ahead for when we reach that new normal and how we can then fundraise. So on that note, I'll go back to Redina and say, so we're seeing now that people are settling into this season. They know that the projects, if you're in the middle of a capital project, or maybe you need to raise funds to pay staff, going ahead to support young people or something. So Redina, maybe a couple of ideas from you about what we can do now so that as we go into the future, we are ready and poised to fundraise.
Yes. I mean, I would say the first thing to do now is to create what I would say a new case for support or a new plan. You know, for the church was doing ministry in a certain way, had already planned, for example, that through the community outreaches we are doing these types of activities. You know, we have this funding coming from, you know, our congregation, from maybe some outside trusts, from our, you know, from letting our building and so on. So now the church looking forward, what will the world look like? How will the church add value to life in the local community? What the church's pastoral ministry will be like. I mean, I was fascinated to see how many ministers and vicars from all walks of, you know, a church actually jumped into the digital services and the outreach and trying to engage with more people in the wider community and thinking of ways of, you know, how can we increase the number of people who are engaging with our live stream on Sunday morning and so on. So now we have got this wider congregation, this wider community that has looked at the church for hope and for support and for, you know, a sense of stability. So how is the church going to serve in the next 8 to 12 months? I mean, again, it doesn't have to be a massive plan, but something that says, what are the needs we will address? How will we go about addressing these new needs? Why are these needs pressing? What kind of funding is now needed to actually help us be church, to help us be the voice and the hands of Jesus and to serve our communities? So this is the first thing. If you don't have a plan, people are not going to rally and support you simply because you are asking them to increase their giving by 10 or 15 pounds a month or to start giving by direct debit. The answer is why? What's a compelling reason? If I am as a donor, you know, often I think the church, that one of the biggest challenges for the church is that it has assumed that everybody knows what the church does and why it's vital for the people it serves and for the community. Now the church has to learn from charities and has to learn how to actually articulate its story, how to share this story with different audiences or with different groups that will have a stake and an interest in supporting the church. So in that respect, once this new, you know, I would say a new plan or case for support is created, and I often, you know, I mean, I have resources and we can continue other conversations about how do you express this in a sort of, through a story, through a narrative that people understand, and how do you even engage people? You know, now when people are having their small groups, get people to start praying about what the future will be like. How will you, as a steward of God's money and resources and time, going to participate in serving the community through our church? So it needs the plan, but also it needs kind of energizing its people and making each congregation member feel that they are really an important member of the church, that they have a role to play. Again, when I talk about the church, I apply the rule of sort of the thirds, like 30% of the people who are the core volunteers, those who lead projects and groups and so on, they're the ones who support the church greatly. And then there is another sort of 30% who give generously. And then there is this 30-40% people in the margins, and they have skills and they have talents and they have money that they can contribute, but they are never asked in a personalized, in an individual way. You know, often, even in a church setting, we say, oh, if some help is needed, talk to Mike. If I'm new to the church and I want to help, I don't even know who Mike is, because Mike doesn't stand up, you know. So it is a big step for an outsider to go and find Mike and, you know, talk about volunteering or to get the direct debit form. I mean, this situation found especially the church completely unprepared, because the church has no online giving channels. Most churches didn't have anything on their websites to actually encourage people to give. So they had to quickly, some of them kind of thinking on their feet, but others need to set up channels and ways for people to contribute to the church directly. So I think it's, you know, it's creating the plan, it's thinking about how do we communicate this new plan or this new vision through different stories. You know, this is the kind of person we're helping. This is how they could benefit. Will you join in? And then looking at different groups. I mean, I'm talking more about the insiders now, for people who are going to church to then consider, you know, how will you support this? What contribution will you make? You know, the church can look. I was looking at the sort of civil society website, and they have listed a number of organizations and government bodies and local bodies that could make grants to small community organizations, including churches. But unless the church knows why they need the money for and how much they need and why they are the best people to meet this need, then they are probably not going to access that funding. So I think this is a time to kind of, you know, to kind of lengthen the cords and prepare the tent and do that thinking and that planning. You know, I often look at Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2. And for me, this is in a sense a model, like the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed. And Nehemiah feels this burden from God that he has to do something because their people are in shame. I mean, not that the church is in shame now, but we have got this kind of, you know, our walls have broken down. This situation has changed the game. And Nehemiah prayed. And then the king told him, what is it? Why have you got a long face? He shared the situation. And now here is somebody who is not even a Jewish believer who said, I respect the king of Israel, so I will start giving, you know, start supporting. And Nehemiah travels back with money and with plans. And then he spends these 2 weeks walking around the walls and thinking which tribe would actually fit and do the work for building that particular part of the wall. So now it's that time of thinking and planning and getting, you know, everything in place. And then having, you know, a new fundraising plan that will engage congregation members, the community, and outside sources to actually support the work of the church.
And it is interesting what you say, and Gordon kind of touched on this, that some people now, if they're working from home and are not having to travel, not only have additional income, which they may be prepared to give if you ask them, but they also have time. And we've been encouraged by the government and other people to take up something new, develop new skills. And good stewardship isn't just about giving money, it's time, it's talents, it's treasure. So I do think that there is quite a lot to be said, especially if you are within a church setting, to look at those church members. And as a vicar, you would hopefully know your congregation quite well to see who is in that position, who could help you further. And I guess thinking not just in churches, but if as a Christian organisation, you've spent time building up relationships with your supporters, again, go back to them and ask, because a fundraising adage, if you don't ask, you don't get. And I think that's really important. Sorry, Gordon, I butted in there because I just needed to say something, but please do.
No, it's very good. And I think the aspect there of, how do we get from where we are now in the moment of lockdown to the aftermath when we reach, excuse me, this new normal. Well, I did give this some thought, and I actually think that for the time being, I think there is an opportunity to use social media, email, the electronic online means for making a quick intervention right now and putting forward the case. I mean, Redina's mentioned the case for support. I think that's absolutely critical. Demonstrating need, but real need. And I think that people will be very receptive at the moment to our news, that they'll want to hear from us, whether it's in an email, social media, and as I say, frequently. Repetition brings recognition, brings reward. Just give you a sort of an example of how, I guess it's sort of social psychology really, but I don't know about everybody else out there, but we've received sort of phone calls from Australia, from long lost aunts and uncles who are, we've not heard from years, just as, how are you getting on? How's lockdown affecting you? So I think that natural curiosity can be played upon, because after all, our supporters, when you think of, a church parish, a church community, it's very, very important to us. That's a sort of critical thing, whether we're, a charity that's fighting a cause which is important to us. People want to know, our supporters want to know what's going on. How is this affecting you? How is lockdown affecting you? What is going to happen afterwards? So I think they will be very receptive to this message at the moment. And if we can just explain, well, thank God we're doing okay. We're managing, we've not had to sort of furlough staff. And I thought it was a really good point that Redina made actually earlier on about, people being sort of dazzled in the headlights, organisations being down, let's go into furlough. Well, no, that's not what's required at the moment. It really is a question of communicating with people and keeping that engagement, trying to engage with them, probably in the same way that with our neighbours. Many of us probably haven't seen our next door people who live in the same street as us for years, and we've re-engaged. And I think this is a perfect analogy really with our own supporters. I think there's an awareness, a receptiveness in people's minds at the moment where they really are willing to listen to what's going on, because we're all in this together,
Absolutely. And people really, really do want to help, but they need to know how they can help.
Do it. Yeah.
And so it's our job, I would suggest, to let them know. And we do now have this amazing opportunity through digital, whether it is social media, whether it's Zooming. One of the churches in London has recently worked in partnership with an organisation called Give Tap, and they now have a QR code on their church website. So you can actually, and hands up, I'm not digitally kind of innovative in any shape or form, but I was taken through. So with my iPhone, I could point it at their website and it came up, and I was taken to the resource I needed to make a donation straight away. They have also used exactly that technology during their Sunday services. So during the kind of a song where they would normally have a collection, what they say just beforehand is, if anybody would like to make a donation, please click, use your phone or go to our website and everything, because we do need to look at ways to engage not only the people who are within our regular church family, but those who are now streaming in. And I think it's something that recent research has flagged up, that something like 1 in 4 people are now accessing a service because they can online. They don't want to go to church, but they have access to a Zoom. And if you look at the Diocese of London website, and apologies for those not in the diocese, but you've actually got a list of all those churches that are Zooming. So look at ways that you, as a Christian organisation or a church, can make it as easy as possible for people to give. And I think it was Debo who came up and said that they have very few people who give regularly. But, you know, there are ways that you can say to those people, I know that you usually give through a plate collection or through envelopes, but at this point, would you consider making your donation through kind of, I don't know, a QR code or by standing order? If you're in the parish giving scheme, you can promote the parish giving scheme, but tell people, share with people why, you know, that you need the money, why you need the money, and whether it is for just the normal running of your church. And just there, and before I just kind of take a break, just to say that in 2008, research has shown that charities who hunkered down and did nothing took a long time to recover, whereas those charities that spent that time building and maintaining their relationships when the time was right, and as recovery started, they were the people that were poised to go and start kind of fundraising, and they almost had a head start. They were the first off the blocks, which is really, really interesting.
I mean, I would also say, you know, yes, digital is important, but do not ignore direct mail, because a number of the, well, constituents and people who come to church are older people. So in that context, I would still, if I was the minister or the church treasurer, I would write to the older members of the congregation who gave, you know, who took the check every Sunday to the church. And I would thank them, first of all, again, something that is really, really key. Over the years, especially in recent sort of times when I focused a little bit more on the power of thanking and appreciating people, it is really important. Again, the church doesn't do this well because we assume that people should give because we are the church. That thank donors, thank the, you know, the congregation members for their long-standing commitment to the church, for their support to the church, and then ask them. You can even say to them, look, you can call your bank, and the bank will direct you through the steps of giving by direct debit. Just have your card with you. Make it easy, you know, for those people, but explain those simple steps in a letter, or say, you know, yes, we haven't been to church for 8 weeks now, and I know you are a faithful supporter of our church, and you put aside something to give to the church. Maybe you want to send just one check to the church office with a bigger contribution. You know, consider however you want to do this, but this is really important. Also, because people like that sense of togetherness. Even now, through the leaders of those groups that met in your church community hall, you can actually do a very small, you know, maybe more digital on Facebook or crowdfunding little fundraising drive to save the church hall. Because, you know, these months that they have not been there, they have not been together, they have not contributed. So you can put the church in the front by saying, well, the church is a place of hope. We have tried to be a, you know, hope to our community. Maybe the church members have been volunteering to get medicines or to buy food for the shut-in elderly. This is how we as a church are serving the community. But at the same time, we as a church have this funding gap because we have not been receiving this income. So will you rally with us to keep the church going? So the church is there to serve. But these other people are just asked to contribute coins at the back of their sofa, or to do with their kids. I don't hear that there is lots of money at the back.
I laugh because coins at the back of the sofa is one of the things that fundraisers talk about all the time. Just before I pass over to Gordon for his wisdom on this, if you do have any questions, please do put them through the kind of the messaging, which should be on the right hand side of your screen. There will be, and just to remind you that if you're interested in funding advice clinics, Trudy is going to put the link of their one-to-one 30-minute sessions completely free of charge. And as I said earlier, both Gordon and Redina have very kindly offered their time. So if you want to talk in more depth about your particular problem, please do get in touch. And I think I'm just looking at my notes. There's another focus on funding tomorrow, which is a roundup, and we will just give an overview, and Trudy and I will be talking about the information that we've shared this week, and then there'll be a resource going out. We're also going to ask you to fill in a short survey at the end of this session, just to help us plan ahead. Because if we are in here for that long haul, it would be useful to know what you would find helpful from both Capital Mass and the at Fund My Church team. Okay, and at that point, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to hand over to Gordon. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Well, again, I think it's a great question about where do we go from here, new normal. And do you know what? I think the answer to that question, I don't think anybody really knows, if they're truthfully honest about the thing. But, you know, I always think that a sure way to go when you're not sure of what the next step is to look back at the basics. What are the basics of fundraising? The basics of marketing. And what struck me about this coronavirus crisis more than anything is the need to have sustainable funding or streams of funding. I remarked right at the beginning about my story where I panicked because one of my clients had just done a direct mail for them, had gone in the post, and I really didn't know. It's the first major appeal of the year, due to end in March. And, you know, I didn't know whether or not it was going to land, whether or not people were going to be responsive, or whether or not the Royal Mail was going to deliver back the donations. So it's sort of, and speaking to other organisations, it became even clearer that the biggest concern they had was not with individual donors, but with their major givers, you know, people who provide them with grants, especially. So you're talking about trusts and foundations. I mean, trusts and foundations could quite easily be affected by this pandemic. And their funds, their resources may be restricted. So that means that they're unable to give out as many grants or as bigger grants as they have done in the past. So it really got me thinking about, well, you know, it makes sense from a business point of view to spread your resources as broadly as possible rather than sort of restrict them to one or two high donors, trusts or foundations that gives you maybe the majority of your funding. Because if something does happen bad to these organisations or big donors as a result of the coronavirus crisis, then the impact on that is going to be far more disproportionate in terms of your funding. So I just thought, well, why not look, you know, go back to basics, look at a very broad strategy for fundraising, trying to get in smaller lots of individual donors, but with a means of generating sustainable income. And there only is really one answer to that question, and that is regular giving, whether that's by direct debit, standing order, debit card. The great thing with regular giving is it doesn't actually take many donors to start generating quite significant sums of money if the process is sustained. And in the blog I did for this event, I actually looked at, put a figure in there with, here it is. Yeah, by just recruiting 20 supporters per year, that's less than 2 per month, with each supporter donating £20 per month. In the first year, by the end of the first year, you would raise £4,800. If you kept that process going at that rate, £24,000 would be raised for your organisation each year by year 5. So, I mean, the beauty of this would be that come a second wave of coronavirus, God forbid, or another crisis like we've seen this year and in 2008, the chances are that the church's funding wouldn't be as affected, or it's certainly not affected to the same degree as it would be if you lost one of your big donors, one of your major sources of income. So that would be my sort of take home from all of this, is sustainability, trying as hard as possible to just get the message out to people, tell them what the need is, and saying that the way that they can respond to that need is by simply taking out a regular donation of 10, 15, £20 a month. There are two ways that you can do this. At the moment, I would say social media is a very good way of recruiting people, signing people up for regular giving. When things get back to normal, I would say that meetings, public meetings, parish meetings are an excellent way of doing this. What would be required would be a good, interesting speaker with something relevant to say about either the cause you're fighting or for your local parish church, and inviting people to that event. It could be a coffee morning, it could be a lunch, it could be an evening event, it could be a dinner, and then just demonstrating that need during the course of the evening, and just asking people to sign up for direct debit, or at the very least ask them for their email. Because once you've got their email and you start building email addresses and you've got the consent to do that, you can always keep those lines of communication open. You can always ask them for a donation. You can always ask them to, as Carol was saying, if they have any spare time to dedicate, to offer for the cause as well. And also, it gives you an opportunity to ask for donations and direct debits on an intermittent basis, but a frequent basis, which is not going to be interrupted by by emergencies, by problems with mail, that sort of thing. And I do take Redina's point, keep sending mail out, because it's still the best means of generating donations. It's the most responsive medium. Ideally, send mailing out with email, because you get what they call a synergy effect. It increases the response from both parts, from both channels. So
what you're suggesting is you should send a letter and an email at the same time to the same person.
Ideally, yes. It comes back to this principle of recognition, or repetition brings recognition, brings reward.
Okay.
The more often they see that, and the more often different channels we use, because some of us are more receptive to some channels than others.
Yeah.
So it increases the chance that they're going to recognize what the need is and give them the opportunity, or give us the opportunity to demonstrate the need and give them the opportunity to respond with a donation or time or whatever it may be.
Thank you. But just a reminder that under PECRA, you cannot email anybody without gaining their consent.
Correct.
Although you can actually write to them and then ask if you can email. So just don't fall foul of GDPR and PECRA. But,
yeah, and if you're sorry, Carol, but just one thing on that point, which is very important. You use your meetings as a means to collect people's signatures, or their emails.
Address, yeah.
Yeah, you've got their consent then, so you don't have to worry about PECRA. You can just include that in with when you ask for the email address.
Thank you. So a question from Steve. We're used to fundraising for particular one-off projects. What he and possibly others are thinking about at the moment is a loss of revenue income as a result of this crisis. And I understand that is huge. There are some emergency funding grant funds available through the London Community Fund, and we will send that link. But given that, I will just hand over to Redina for 2 minutes to any ideas about fundraising for loss of revenue, and then Gordon 2 minutes as well. And I say 2 minutes because we're getting to the end of our time together, so in case there are other questions.
For loss of revenue, so it's money that was coming through this building hire and so on.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's, I would say, as I said before, probably I would try and do a small fundraising drive by trying to engage with the people who use the church buildings. And by saying to them why the church is an important part of the community, get them to maybe make small individual contributions. Again, there could be like women's Zumba group, or, maybe some other, although some of these groups could be a bit sensitive because they could be like Alcoholics Anonymous, or, some addiction recovery groups where it might not be appropriate to ask them for money. So I would first see, okay, where the revenue came from. Is there a way of perhaps communicating with some of these people and actually encourage them to make a donation out of the, you know, the funds they might have available as an organization or community group, or try to make a wider drive to the community. I would also look, I mean, you know, Gordon was talking about regular giving, but also if you are a church or a small community organization, maybe you need to do a little bit of thinking around major donor fundraising. You know, are there any sort of perhaps wealthy Christians living in your area? Start thinking through the people that you know, making some connections. I once worked for a small sort of Christian counseling charity in New Forest, and actually the secretary of the CEO happened to know a guy who was a wealthy guy going to her church, who gave generously to local charities in the area. So maybe you need to look at some of the possibilities that somebody would actually give you some money. But I would not go and make the ask to them by saying, we lost this revenue, please give us some cash. I would present to them that future plan. You know, we need this money because this is what we as a church, this is how we can do something good for the community because this money comes to us. This is focusing on the positive impact you could be making. Because people are not going to give just to, to fill a budget.
No. No. Understand that. Gordon.
Yeah, just one final point actually is, don't be afraid to tell supporters about your plight.
The truth.
Yes.
Tell them the truth. If things are bad, tell them it's bad.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like a family. You know, if I get a call from my 24-year-old son and he says, Dad, you know, my flatmate's up and left me with all the bills to pay, which happened this time last year.
Oh.
You know, what do families do? I mean, first of all, you say, well, okay, perhaps you've learned a lesson there, an important lesson, and be a bit careful next time. But I think in this situation, everybody realizes that it's nobody's fault. It's not the church's fault. It's not the charity's fault that this pandemic has, ripped through the country and had an awful effect on people and things in their lives. And people will be receptive to that. They'll want to help. So don't be afraid to say, if, for instance, we were going to send out a prize draw raffle or do a sponsored event in March, we couldn't do that because of the pandemic. It would have raised £20,000. We don't have that money anymore. Give them the figures, make it real, and people will respond. And I think you'll find very quickly that you will cover those losses and even perhaps surpass them, because people who are engaged are very generous. And I think that's particularly true of Christians, people who are churchgoers, and who have those Christian values of looking after our neighbour.
I think that's very true. And my family, my husband's a group organizer for Spring Harvest. For those of you who aren't aware of Spring Harvest, it's a Christian conference that's held at Easter every year. We've taken a group from our local churches for a very long time. They cancelled at very short notice, and they had, say, 4 events over the Easter period. They were left with a hole of £1.5 million, and they appealed right from the start. They said, we're going to do what we can. And in fact, they put on an online resource for a week through YouTube, which was really interesting. We're going to do what we can, but we're facing 1.5 million, a 1.5 million hole. Please help us. And I think at the last count, so this is since probably just about the start of lockdown, they had raised nearly all of that money from their supporters, because they had been honest. They did what they could, but they knew they needed to fill a hole. So that's a really positive point, I think, to take on board, that if you are honest, if you explain what's happening in this time, and if you can just appeal to people, not necessarily those within your church family, sometimes it's the wider community. If you are in touch with them, and put some sort of digital collection, QR code or ask on your Zoom meeting or your church website or your organisational website, it's not going to fill the whole left by revenue, but it may, by lack of revenue funding, but it may just take you. And who knows? Gordon, you mentioned a gift of £30,000.
Yeah,
that is just completely awesome. So we're coming up to our last 5 minutes, and just before then,
because you mentioned, I mean, there is a sort of a small outfit called the Church Digital Toolkit. So if you Google them, actually some really great guys, I kind of have seen them online, that they can provide plenty of technical advice on what are some of the best sort of digital solutions for churches of all sizes and all budgets to actually help you take this forward. Because I am aware that we are talking like we are assuming that actually churches have built up email lists and they have built up some of these communication structures, when in fact what this pandemic showed is that churches did not even have the up-to-date directories of their current members, and they then struggled. So before you launch the communications, you need to take a step back and actually say, you know, what access do we have to people? How many people do we have? How then are we going to guide them to, you know, to give online or to encourage them to do other things? So by, you know, getting in touch with these guys, and they often are doing things for a very small fee or even offering a lot of free advice and support, then you can actually benefit from, you know, sound, practical, technical advice on helping you to build things up. And I would say, you know, Google is your best friend. I mean, these kind of workshops are good, but when I have a question, I just go to Google and I say, what are the best books on crowdfunding? You know, that could be one of the ways of going forward. Just buy a book for $17.99 from Amazon, read it, and then try, you know, maybe with a small group, you might need at this time not to take this burden forward alone. As a church leader, you know, take 3 or 4 people, create a small stewardship committee, not a finance committee that gets bogged down on every detail of accounts, but of people with vision and people who know how to engage with others and people who know how to share stories. You know, do a bit of reading and studying together. And as Gordon was saying, think creatively. God will provide if we do it in the right way and, you know, for the right reasons. We just have to take those steps of faith and put things together. If this works, continue. You do something, it doesn't work, that's absolutely fine. Then just drop it and do something else. You know, don't be afraid. We don't really know what's the right solution for every one of you. We are just giving some general advice that you then, you know, have to try it out and then learn and develop other things.
And also, you don't have to do this by yourself. There are people around, especially now, who may have more time on their hands. So ask, please ask. Redina, thank you for that. Gordon, we've got kind of 3 minutes left, so maybe you'd just like to add something before I round up the session.
Yes, just, you know, think about what the needs are. I mentioned earlier on about sometimes within the organisation we can become very blasé about what we need, and our needs become very sort of run-of-the-mill. They don't seem very appealing to us, but they will be to our supporters. So, you know, even if just for 5 minutes with your staff, your team, on your own, just start listing 3 points which are critical need. It could be financial need. It could be the needs that are going unmet because of the current crisis, and that they need to upgrade your services. We need to actually generate more money, not just stand still, but generate more money to meet the needs that have been created by the current situation. And just I would say, just really think about developing those needs and making them as appealing as possible. And as you said before, this idea of just being honest with people, they really appreciate that, you know, being honest. It's one of the best, you know, we should be really, whenever we make any sort of appeal for money, we should be imagining that we're quite lucky today because we're all in this situation. It's easy to understand it. We're sitting down across the coffee table from somebody in our lounge, in our kitchen, and we're just explaining, you know, Carol, you know, the problem we've got right now is this. You know, it's going to be such a shame if we can't get this money to do X, Y, and Z. And just making your appeals in that way, I think will touch people who genuinely appreciate what you're doing. And yeah, as I say, just 3 points of need, I think, and just try to focus on what they are, try and develop them, and look at ways of sending that message of need out through social media, because it's cheap. It's easy because you can put it on social media, you can put it on email, you can put it on your website, but also if you get the opportunity and you have the funds to do it by direct mail as well, through advertising in parish newsletters, in church magazines, newspapers, that sort of thing. But just repetition brings recognition, brings reward.
So that's repetition brings recognition, brings reward. Right. So maybe you'd like to kind of share that with the panel through the chat box before you go, Gordon. That would be really, really helpful. Right, we're at the end of this session. Normally with capital mass sessions, everybody kind of gets a chance to chat and ask questions. I know that's not been as easy today because we're such a big group, but does anybody have maybe one last question for our panel before they go? So if you do, please just unmute and ask. Wow, we must have done a good job. So a final plug to say that, to say thank you very much to Gordon, very much to Redina. Thank you very much to Capital Mass for hosting this and bringing us all together. There will be a recording of this on the Capital Mass website, and we will share that with you. There is our final roundup tomorrow, after which everybody who has registered for any one of these webinars will receive a list of all the kind of the resources that are available. I will also put in some links to the fundraising blogs because Trudy flagged up Captain Tom. And Captain Tom is one of those success stories. But the main thing to drag from that is that people give to people. The reason this was such a successful appeal was here was a World War II vet who wanted to do something to support the NHS before he reached his 100th birthday. He already had an existing relationship with a local hospital. He'd had a hip replacement, or he'd had his hip repaired. So when they went into lockdown and started to treat COVID-19 patients, he wanted to do something to say thank you. And he and his daughter came up with this idea of doing like 99 laps before his 100th birthday. £1,000 was the target. When I blogged about this last week, something like thank you very much indeed, had been raised. But it was because people could identify this guy fills so many gaps. He's elderly, World War II veteran. He wanted to do something to go back to the NHS. He wanted to say thank you. He's now set up his own foundation. And the reason he set up his own foundation was because his wife had been in hospital and had said to him, if you didn't come to see me every day, I would be so lonely. So one of the issues that the foundation is trying to kind of plug is that of loneliness. On the Diocese of London website, there is a COVID-19, it's coronavirus COVID-19. There is a box there that says Parish Finances and Fundraising. On that tab, there's a whole list of emergency funding funds that you can access. And Steve, that might be really useful for you because their crisis response is to deal with people who are in your situation with revenue funding loss. So please do look. I will send that or give that information to Trudy to put on the Capital Mass resource that's going out tomorrow. But in the meantime, at nearly 3:05, and as a fundraiser, I can talk the hind leg off a donkey. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been lovely to see you. I hope that's helped. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Redina. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.